The Biden administration is privately encouraging Ukraine's leaders to signal an openness to negotiate with Russia and drop their public refusal to engage in peace talks unless President Vladimir Putin is removed from power, according to people familiar with the discussions. I wanted to talk to you guys about a Washington Post article that broke about the United States asking Ukraine privately to show to the world that it's open to negotiating with Russia. The United States has gotten a lot of criticism, particularly from, the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the Brianna Joy Grays, the Jimmy Dores, I would say people who are not in the political mainstream mostly, but all over the political spectrum. I would say mostly from the right, though, the far right, for not pushing Ukraine to enter negotiations like right now, or like around right now. We need to push Ukraine to negotiate more, is the idea. Right? And the idea goes, it's pretty simple, that nobody wants a war in Ukraine. You don't end wars without talking to your opponent. So we need to negotiate and enter the war. Negotiate a ceasefire almost immediately, because that's the quickest way to stop the bloodshed. What isn't talked about in that analysis is how the Russians have used ceasefires in the past to adjust their strategic position and then use it in a negative manner to try to target Ukraine and attack Ukraine. And it's not just Ukraine that they've done this to. They use ceasefire as a strategic opportunity, and they're not negotiating in good faith in many instances. So there is a risk of that happening, especially since Russia has had so many logistical issues and manpower issues and need to repair a lot of bridges, and they're currently withdrawing from somewhere like Kherson, where they need to be actively pursued by, to be out, to cause maximum damage. So basically, they don't always negotiate in good faith. And Russia's position has yet to realign itself with reality. You can tell Ukraine to negotiate, but it's hard to negotiate with somebody who's saying that as a bare minimum, they need to get Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. And then maybe they'll have a conversation about things like Odessa, and maybe they'll negotiate about things they haven't even captured. And that's as they're being pushed out of Kharkiv, as they're withdrawing from Kherson, as they're being pushed back. So until the Russian position realigns back to reality, the reality of Ukraine's territorial integrity, and of Ukraine having the upper hand here right now, when it comes to the battlefield, it's kind of hard for the Ukrainians to negotiate with them until they realign themselves to reality. A lot of things when it comes to national, foreign policy and stuff like that, especially realism, a lot of it depends upon your other geopolitical opponents that you're, playing chess against, quote unquote, that they're rational actors. And I don't think that Putin is irrational in the idea that he's a madman, but I think that there is some interests about serving Putin's interest personally, like his political interests about, holding on to power, that have become more important than the amount of pain and suffering that he puts Russia through by continuing to send its young to die in Ukraine, even if the war is generally unwinnable. I think most military analysts would see the position Russia's in and say, wow, they're in a really bad position. Maybe they should withdraw or try to negotiate like some dual citizenship for the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, or something, and maybe Crimea, or maybe they, who knows, maybe they could salvage Crimea. But instead, because Putin doesn't want this invasion to look like a massive failure and possibly lead to the end of his regime, he's kind of holding out. And so to the Ukrainians, you got to force them out. Like, there is another way out of this war, and it isn't through necessarily negotiating right now. It's through negotiating either A, when we're in a better position, and we've pushed them fully out of Kherson, or maybe just straight up winning. Anyway, let's read the article. U.S. privately asked Ukraine to show it's open to negotiate with Russia. The Biden administration is privately encouraging Ukraine's leaders to signal an openness to negotiate with Russia and drop their public refusal to engage in peace talks unless President Vladimir Putin is removed from power, according to people familiar with the discussions. The request by the way, this was done specifically under the idea that it would send a signal to other oligarchs, in my opinion. The idea of like, hey, there's a way out of this. Remember, the world doesn't need to blow up for this madman. The request by American officials is not aimed at pushing Ukraine to the negotiating table. This is the interesting part. Rather, They called it a calculated attempt to ensure the government in Kiev maintains the support of other nations facing constituencies wary of fueling a war for many years to come. The discussions illustrate how complex the Biden administration's position on Ukraine has become, as U.S. officials publicly vow to support Kiev with a massive sum of aid for as long as it takes, while hoping for a resolution to the conflict that over the past 8 months has taken a punishing toll on the world economy. So, the idea is that America pushes Ukraine to negotiate and behind closed doors, but like to come out and say they're in favor of negotiations. To come out and tell the world, like, yes, we'll negotiate with Russia if they negotiate in good faith and give us a decent offer. And it's not necessarily because we think Russia's going to make a decent offer, or Russia's going to be a rational actor and Russia's going to be a fair actor, or it's because we think Russia is going to react to this by saying, okay, we're willing to withdraw from Ukraine. I think the offer's being made to show the international community that Russia still hasn't realigned their position, that they're about to lose the city of Kherson in a withdrawal, and they still haven't read the writing on the wall. Of course, the situation can change. Wars are wars, battlefields are battlefields. I'm not an expert on that. But it doesn't take a genius to realize that Russia's in a difficult position right now. And so if the Ukrainian government is coming out and saying, yes, we're willing to negotiate, if you respect our territorial integrity and all these things, yada, 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 then there's no downside to it. Because Putin's not going to come out and say, okay, I'm going to give you all your territory right now. Maybe he will when he's in even worse position after the Kherson withdrawal. Who knows what happens in the future? But this has no negative effect to Ukraine. It makes the position of the United States and Ukraine much clearer, as they're going to give clear, like, hey, here's our position. So it makes it easier for them to negotiate and make their case to the world that, hey, these are reasonable demands. And you want to know what? After this urgent, this urging in private, Ukraine responded by saying that they're willing to consider genuine negotiations with Russia. And ahead of his address to world leaders at a global climate summit on Tuesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his country was willing to consider genuine negotiations with Russia. Zelensky said Ukraine would be open to talks with Moscow if Ukraine's borders are restored, victims of Russia's invasion and attacks are compensated, and efforts are made to hold perpetrators accountable. All of this is 100% reasonable, and that is why Moscow will reject it for at least the time being. But it also shows to the world stage how unreasonable the Russian position is, because anybody reading this would be like, well, that makes sense. They invaded Ukraine, so they, give their land back. They compensate those they hurt, and they hold the people who did rapes and murders and war crimes accountable. But if Putin was to accept this right now, oh, the humiliation, not only on him, but on the legacy of Russia from his ideological point of view. Not to mention, it would very well probably be political suicide. And so, for now, Russia is going to stay in its unreasonable, untenable, unsustainable position on Ukraine until they're in an even worse position, which is inevitably going to come to fruition as we see them withdrawing from Kherson right now. Maybe it's a false flag and I'm being tricked. Who knows? The KGB and the CIA work in mysterious ways, but the situation for the Russians right now is very, very difficult. And the Ukrainians, by doing this, are going to be able to capture. They've generally won the PR war. Let's be for real. The Russians have kind of given up on the PR war ever since they've started doing this dirty bomb talk and all this other nonsense. It's not convincing barely anybody except for political extremists and conspiracy theorists. The vast majority of the world community, as you can tell from any UN vote, support Ukraine. So it's not like Zelensky isn't good at the PR war already, or hasn't won the PR war already, or doesn't have the support of the world already. But there's always the risk of, definitely since this comes, with negative economic implications, not trading with the Russian Federation, that since this comes with negatives, there's a worry that, the Ukrainian community won't get its support by the international community if they, lose interest. They no longer care. They're not paying attention anymore. And so by doing this, it makes very clear what Ukraine's position is, which is good. And it shows that it's very reasonable, and the Ukrainians aren't negotiating from a position of absurdity. So I think this is a very smart move by the Biden administration. I think there's a very smart move by Zelensky to take that advice. Now, if you ask the Ukrainian people about negotiations with Russia right now, as Al Jazeera is reporting on here, they do a lot of interviews in this article. I suggest you guys go and read it. The majority of Ukrainians don't really want to negotiate with Russia right now. Or if they do, it would have to be on the terms that Zelensky just set out. So if any of you guys are thinking, well, you know, what if all these people who are talking about, you know, giving up Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhia, and that Putin has some good points. You know, what about the Ukrainian people? What about their suffering? What about all the deaths they're going through? I'm sure they're not going to be happy about this. It seems generally, after finding out about the scale of the war crimes with the largest mass graves since the Yugoslav Civil War being uncovered in Izium, that most Ukrainians are willing to see this war through towards victory. Not to mention, I think a lot of people have really undercounted and didn't give enough credit to the Ukrainian spirit and the Ukrainian sense of identity. They have struggled for hundreds of years for independence. Voltaire wrote about it. So I think a lot of them are also going to be angry about the idea of giving up even a shred of that. Not to mention, in the eyes of a lot of these people, definitely after all these reports about war crimes came out, if they were to give up Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhia, Kherson, Crimea, etc., there's a decent chance a lot of war crimes would continue, and they see it kind of like signing their brother's death warrant. And so it's good that Ukraine's giving the signal. I think it was a smart move by the United States to give Ukraine this advice. I think it shows Ukraine's position is moral and makes their position clear. I think it'll show the international community that Ukraine's position is not ridiculous. It's a respectable position, but also it puts the Russians in a position where, like, they can ask for negotiations and they'll be given an offer now, but it's not an offer I guess they're willing to accept at this time because they have still to align their worldview with reality. It's still filled up with, you know, Putin's own political interests and maybe ego to a small degree. I think nationalism is a large part of it. So, good move. I'm happy with this result. The Ukrainian people stand steadfast when it comes to their support of the government, and the Ukrainian government now is messaging better to the world community and making their position very clear, which I'm happy about. Fog of war should be generally avoided. Good job, Zelensky and Biden.